Hello everybody, my name is Daulton Nelson, and today I'd love to give my thoughts on a game I just beat, that game being Bound for the PS4. Bound was co-developed by two studios, one of which being Santa Monica Studios, popular for their God of War franchise, as well as collaborating with many smaller developers to get their projects off the ground. The other studio being Plastic Studios, whose previous projects included Catzilla and Datura. Now, I didn't know much about Bound going into it. The only way I found out about the game was through it being free on PS Plus. However, a little research I did before playing the game revealed that this game was inspired by games like that video game company's Journey and Campo Santo's Firewatch. To me, this inspiration was very obvious throughout my playthrough of Bound. Anyone who'd like to argue elsewise hasn't read or seen the credits of the game, where these inspirations are explicitly stated. One thing that worried me about Bound was that it was labeled as an art game. Usually this label is stuck to games that have very minimal gameplay and a very stylistic art approach, normally foregoing high-res models for a more pleasing and simplistic art style. I think sticking this label to these kind of games is pretty easy for the gaming community, as it makes a game sound like it has more to it than what is actually presented, and discounts some truly great games that make more of an artistic statement with their whole package. This includes games like Toby Fox's Undertale and Austin Jorgensen's Lisa the Painful. I'm not saying games like Journey or Firewatch aren't art. I just think the gaming community is always trying too hard to prove to people that video games are an art form. And in that quest, they are quick to label some games as art without considering the content that is presented. Now, I didn't see anything where Plastic Studios had explicitly tagged Bound as an art game, so I won't think about Bound as anything more than it actually is. However, I will be comparing it to Journey a lot throughout my thoughts, so if that displeases you, I am sorry, but it was painfully obvious to me. Starting off with the graphics and style of Bound, the game is split into two different artistic styles. First, there are two realities within Bound. There is a real world and a fantasy world. The real world style reminded me of an acrylic painting. Its color palette consisted of tans and devalued blues, which made sense to me considering that the real world scenes only took place on a beach. The fantasy world's graphical style is much more abstract, with everything being very cubic and jaggy. The only complex structures within the world are the characters, so usually they stuck out from the background. Again, oranges and blues take center stage within the color palette, but in the fantasy world, they are much more saturated and bright. I like the character designs of the princess and her mother. I thought the monster and the savior had very similar designs, and I often confused the two. The real-world models and designs are mostly fine, but I thought the facial designing could have used some work. The real-world's main protagonist had a face that looked like it bore upon the uncanny valley. Animations are really fluid in Bound. Animations between states felt seamless and natural. The animations are also very detailed. To give an example of this, the idle animations of characters had a lot of thought put into them. For example, in the beginning of the game when you're on the beach, if you stand in the sand, the woman will play with the sand using her feet. But if she is in the ocean, she will splash the sea with her feet instead. I saw in the credits Plastic Studios got a dancer to do some of the motion capture for the princess's animations. The princess's animations were the most convincing and really looked like she was dancing as she was moving. Overall, I really liked the graphics and style of Bound. The story of Bound is very interpretive. Before I continue, I'd just like to state now that anything I say about the story of Bound is of my own interpretations, and may not be the developer's intentions. For my first playthrough of the game, Bound's story to me was about the real-world protagonist and her worries about being pregnant and the very negative things she remembers from her childhood, and how those things might happen to her child. There are a couple things that hinted at this for me. The princess and her mother didn't really have a good relationship within the fantasy world to begin with, and I thought this translated into our protagonist and her relationship with her mother in the real world. Often within the story, the mother of the princess would leave her alone, normally to do something to fix on her own. There was one time when the mother character was watching TV, but once the princess arrives, she tells the princess to leave her alone because she wanted to have time for herself. Other times, the mother seemed to be overprotective, like in the scene with the paper airplanes. To me, I interpreted this as the real-world protagonist and her mother having a bad relationship just like this, and maybe the mother was a bit negligent towards our protagonist when she was a child. Another thing that supported my interpretation was the kingdom within the fantasy world. The mother alludes to the princess that eventually she will have to take up the mantle of queen within the kingdom. This meant to me that our protagonist was worried about becoming a mother and her taking on the mother role in her own life. The monster in the game that threatens the princess is often very childlike, often screaming at her and climbing up things. To me, I thought the monster was supposed to represent our protagonist's yet-to-be-born child. The savior character at the beginning of the game also states that the kingdom is already gone, possibly alluding to the fact that our character will have to leave her old life behind in order to take care of this child, whatever that old life may be. The third thing that made me interpret the story in that way was all the memories you come across throughout the game. The kid burning his face with the cooking pot liquid represented parental negligence. The plants being destroyed represented reckless behavior from a child that doesn't know any better. The vinyl records being destroyed represented having to give up your past and your interests in order to take care of a child. And the parents arguing by the bed I thought was pretty self-explanatory. There was also a memory of a father playing chess in the beginning of the game. To me, this meant that our character was worrying about what the father would be like towards the child and what the child would inherit from the parents when she grew up. So all of these things put together made me think of the interpretation that I came up with. However, the ending threw me for a loop and presented something different. It is revealed at the very end that the father of our main protagonist had left her when she was a young child, and this was the cause for all the bad memories. The princess in the game is supposed to represent our main protagonist. The mother of the princess is supposed to represent the mother of our protagonist in the real world. The monster is the father, and the savior is our protagonist's brother. One of the final cutscenes in the game is when the princess finally confronts the monster and asks why he left them, to which he replies, "Because I could." And I had a problem with this. To me, these events do not make sense. I did not think any of the memories hinted towards this conclusion, and most of what does happen can just be chalked up to parental negligence or kids not being aware of what they are doing. I didn't think it was something so huge that it would cause the father to leave. After all, families and couples argue all the time. I don't see how this is any different and causes the father to leave. It didn't seem that extreme to me. What's more, I don't see why the protagonist would fear the father as much as she does at the end of the game. I was waiting for some kind of twist, where the mother had been painting the father as evil within our protagonist's childhood after he had left. However, I don't think there's anything there to even hint towards that. After all, I think the mother is just as bad as the father within our protagonist's childhood. I never really had a motivation as a player at the end of the game to go against the father, so the choice at the end really didn't make sense to me. I just went to the father and told him about my pregnancy, or at least gave him the book, opening up the relationship for the future. Upon a second playthrough, I did notice some more things that did hint toward this conclusion. For example, the monster knocking down the king chess piece is some good foreshadowing of what to come. There was also some facial emotions that I missed that I got to see with the game's photo mode that I'll talk about later. But just know that I was able to get a closer look at some characters' faces, where in these memory sequences, you are standing at waist height of most of the characters. Either way, I didn't think the story was bad, but I'm still a little confused even when applying some logic to it. I'd be interested to see what other people's interpretations of the story are. Moving on to the sound of Bound, I liked a lot of the sounds that they used within the game. I like how they treated dialogue by making it really distorted and making it sound like it was somebody's head, or it would be in somebody's head. The soundtrack of Bound was composed by Oleg Shbudeko, also known as Hinali. He's an ambient producer and provides some ambient drone music to Bound's soundtrack. The soundtrack features various looping and swelling synths, as well as a piano throughout its runtime. There was also some occasional additional instruments thrown in there, like a drum. Some of my favorite tracks from Bound were Red, Anger, Misjudgment, Escape, and the game's closing track, The Ocean That I Found. Moving on to gameplay, Bound at its core is a 3D platformer. I saw some critiques at this game that were trying to say that Bound was something more than it actually was. They were saying that because the princess in the game danced as her animations, that this was some sort of genre-bending game. But within Bound, there's nothing that requires you to move rhythmically or within a timed fashion, so the dancing is never implemented in any way other than within the animations. So the animations within Bound are simply that, animations. To say that the dancing makes Bound more than a 3D platformer is to either not know how video games work or to be delusional. As for what the princess can do in order to platform and move around, she can jump, run, roll, quick dodge, and dance. Now dancing is a little different from the animations she uses to move around with. Dancing is done in Bound by holding R2, to which the princess will go into a more flashier animation in which she is entirely invincible. The player can move within this animation, but very slowly, making platforming difficult, but being able to dodge all of the obstacles within the game. And I do mean all of the obstacles within the game. Chances are, if something slows you down or stops you, you can simply get through it by dancing. The most complex Bound gets with its platforming is requiring the player to dash, and then roll, and then jump out of that roll in order to reach a faraway platform. This isn't that difficult in the world of platformers, as it is essentially a long jump. The roll is barely used within the game other than that combination of moves. There was one moment in the beginning of the game when you have to roll into a small hole in order to get further. However, this is only done once as far as I know, and they never use this again. The quick dodge is useless. As I stated earlier, most obstacles can just be danced through, so the player has no incentive to quick dodge unless you're speedrunning. At times, the platforming within Bound didn't feel exactly sturdy. There were a lot of times that I missed a platform even though I was doing the intended actions. For example, there is one platform that you have to roll jump onto. However, you have to be holding left for a certain amount of time during your jump in order to land on this platform. Hold it for too little or too long and you will miss this platform. There are a couple of moments like that throughout Bound. Other times, it seemed as if the princess would just fall through certain platforms, especially stairs. I guess it was the gaps between the stairs that made her fall through, but usually there are invisible colliders that prevent that. I guess in Bound, the colliders are much more accurate to what is being presented to the player. Bound also has a mechanic that helps players latch onto ledges. However, this is inconsistent. Sometimes you would hit a ledge and climb up, and other times the princess would simply slip off the ledge. Another thing that really bugged me in Bound were these little balls that acted like planets, kind of like Super Mario Galaxy. The player would enter their orbit and then rotate around the sphere specifically instead of adhering to the world's rules of gravity. I think for these little ball planet things, they could have pulled the camera back a little bit. It was also very easy to get caught in perpetual motion, especially roll jumping on these little planets. It was also very hard to exit the orbit of these little planet balls, so I think this mechanic overall could have used a bit of tweaking. Speaking upon Bound's camera work, there were some times in Bound where the game would cut between one perspective to another by fading out and then fading in very quickly. To me, these didn't really make sense, or at least some of them didn't. As soon as the game cut back in, the player could just reposition the camera anyway, so I think this cutting only worked for fixed perspectives. Otherwise, I don't see why it was in some of the other portions of the game. Bound also had a speedrunning mode and a photo mode, as well as VR support. The photo mode is pretty robust. There are a lot of settings you can change and adjust. It's pretty cool. I don't have VR, so I wasn't able to try out the VR support. And the game is short enough as is, so I didn't really feel like trying to speedrun the game either. One thing that I found cool about Bound was that each level you completed negated a specific obstacle. For example, clearing the paper airplanes level would clear the paper airplanes obstacle throughout the game. This can make for a different kind of playthrough and open up some paths that you couldn't get to otherwise. However, the levels within Bound are very repetitious. They are all structured the same way. You start by talking to your mother and exiting the same room, go through a series of events that tease towards the memory and focus of the level. You get to a little cubed portrait, then experience the memory through a first-person mode. You would then have to dance your way out of an obstacle, and then finally go through an on-rails ribbon surfing experience, which would all then end with the world kind of collapsing in on itself. I got very tired of this cycle the second time I went through it, and ultimately left me feeling sour about the game's experience. And it is worth mentioning that Bound is more about the experience than it is about playing the game. After all, death is not punishing at all, and will spawn you right where you fell off. In fact, Bound is a very easy game, and very short. It can be completed within a night. The final thing I have to say within the gameplay of Bound is the recovery animation that plays after death. It's fixed, and the player is required to watch it before continuing the game. I think this animation could have been a couple of frames less, as it is a little tiresome to sit through again and again and again. I think just shortening up that animation and letting the player continue the game quicker would have helped the flow of this game a lot. So to conclude my thoughts on Bound, I don't think I can recommend it in a general sense. However, if you like games like Journey, Firewatch, or Abzu, then I think this is the game for you. My final score for Bound would be a 4 out of 10. The thing that knocked Bound down from being average was how similar this game is to Journey. I don't know if it's Journey's shadow being very large, or Bound feeling uninspired. Maybe it's a bit of both. Either way, I could not get past the Journey inspiration within Bound. If you are interested in games of this style, but are looking for something better than Bound, I definitely recommend Journey and Abzu. Also check out the two games I mentioned earlier, Undertale and Lisa the Painful, two very artistic games within my opinion. I think if Plastic Studios and Santa Monica Studios made Bound with some more complex platforming mechanics and a little bit more of an identity, I would have liked it more. That concludes my thoughts for Bound for the PS4. If you liked this, then I don't care if you like or subscribe, that's not what I'm doing this for, but if you could check out my social media links and online portfolio, which are down in the description below, that'd be pretty awesome. Thank you very much, and have a great day.